Eliza Marsh turned the key in the chapel door for the first time in 18 years and told herself it was only glass and lead she had come to mend, nothing more. The lock had rusted to the colour of dried blood, and it fought her for the better part of a minute before it gave. And when it gave, the door did not so much open as exhale, a long breath of cold stone, tallow, and something underneath both of those that she did not let herself name yet, though she knew the smell of old smoke when it found her. Frost had furred the inside of every window she could see from the threshold, so that the December light came through milk pale and directionless, falling on a font gone green, on hassocks eaten soft by mice, on a communion cloth someone had folded with care 18 Christmases ago, and never touched again. She did not step inside at once. She stood on the sill, with the great iron key still warm from her own hand, and took out, from the pocket sewn into her apron for exactly this purpose, a small round pane of glass, no larger than a shilling, deep blue-green at its edges, and painted at its heart with a wren in oxide brown, its wings caught mid-fold, as though the bird had only just that second decided to be still. Her father had cut it the year she was born, and had never fitted it to anything, because the examiners of the Glaziers' Guild in the county town had looked at it once, called it fanciful, and sent him home without his warrant, and he had carried it in his own pocket every working day after that, the way another man might carry a grudge, except that Thomas Marsh had never once spoken of it as a grudge. He had called it his proof, and he had said, more times than Eliza could count, that glass never lies. It only ever shows you the light that was already there. She had inherited the saying along with the roundel and precious little else, and she held both of them now in the doorway of the chapel her father had been blamed for burning, the chapel where his good name had gone in with the smoke and never come out again. 18 years the door had stood locked. 18 years the county had walked around this small grey building on its way to market and crossed itself, or spat, or simply looked elsewhere, according to temperament. And in all that time, no Marsh had been asked inside it, until a letter had come 3 days ago, under the seal of the Dowager Lady Alderley herself, instructing that the chapel of St. Anne be made fit for a Christmas service, to mark the young baron's coming into his inheritance, and that the glazier engaged for the work should be whoever in the parish was willing to take it on, for what little the estate could presently spare. Nobody else had been willing, that was the whole of the matter, and Eliza was not fool enough to dress it up as anything finer. She went home that first evening with plaster dust in her hair, and told Nan Pruitt so, plainly, over a pot of barley broth that had been thinned twice already that week. Nan had raised her since her father's death, had scrubbed the manor's linen for 30 years, and buried 2 husbands, and outlived both without much comment. And she listened to the whole account, with her sleeves still rolled to the elbow from the wash-tub. Nobody else would touch it, Eliza said, because nobody else needs the money as badly as we do, and because a Marsh mending Alderley glass is either an insult to the family or an insult to the mender, and I have not yet worked out which. Nan set down her spoon. "It is neither," she said. "It is simply that the dowager knows exactly what she is doing, which is asking a drowning woman to bail out a boat, and calling it charity when the woman does it." Eliza laughed, despite herself, a short, unwilling sound, and Nan did not smile back, because Nan rarely did, but she reached across the table and turned the roundel over once in her niece's hand before letting it go, as though she were checking a coin for its year. "Your father would have taken the work," she said, "not for the money. To see the inside of that door again with his own eyes, after what they said he did to it." Eliza did not answer that. There were things about her father's last years that she had never let herself examine too closely, the way one does not press a bruise simply to confirm that it still hurts. And the accusation against him was the deepest of these, a green-black mark that had never properly faded, that his lead work around the vestry window had been slack, that a spark or a smoldering wick had found the gap he left, and that Lady Alderley, the old Baron's wife and the present Baron's mother, had burned to death 18 years ago this very month, because a glazier from Nettlecombe had done shoddy work and been too proud or too poor to admit it. No formal charge had ever been laid. There had been no need. The county had tried him in its kitchens and its lanes and found him guilty within the week, and he had died 9 years later, still protesting his innocence to anyone who would stand still long enough to hear it, which by the end had been almost nobody at all. Eliza had grown up mending what other tradesmen would not touch, working always under her cousin's name, because no guild in the shire would grant its warrant to a marsh, taking in dishes soldered by her father and window casements too shameful for a respectable man to be seen carrying. And she had learned, without ever quite deciding to learn it, how to make herself small in rooms full of people who remembered the fire. She banked the fire that night herself, since Nan's hands ached worst in the cold, and she sat a while with the roundel held up to the single candle, turning it so that the wren's brown wing caught the light and threw a small, warm stain across her own knuckles. Tomorrow she would begin the actual work, the counting of broken panes and rotted cane, the long, cold labor of taking a shut thing and coaxing it back toward use. She did not yet know that the vestry window she meant to begin with had not been opened, patched, or even properly examined since the week of the fire, nor that someone besides her father had been inside that frame with a knife and a pot of solder in all the years since, working quietly and well, in a manner that no honest glazier ever needs to work. She only knew, banking the coals and setting the roundel back in her apron pocket where it lived, that a rider had come up the lane that evening while she walked home, moving fast for so cold a night, and that Nan, watching from the window with her arms folded over her chest, had said only that it would be the young Baron himself, back a full week earlier than anybody at the manor had thought to expect him. He was standing in the chancel with his hat still in his hand when Eliza arrived the next morning, and she knew him before he ever turned round, because there are certain ways of standing in an empty room that do not change between the ages of 9 and 7 and 20. Julian Alderley had been a long-legged, solemn boy who used to climb the churchyard wall to watch her father work, asking questions about lead and grozing irons, until old Thomas gave him a scrap of colored glass just to have some peace. And he was a long-legged, solemn man now, dressed for travel rather than for a homecoming, with the particular stillness of someone standing in a room he has spent 18 years being told not to enter. The chapel smelled that morning of tallow, of stone that had never quite dried out, and beneath both of those, fainter now than the day before, but still there if a person knew to look for it, the ghost of old smoke, sweetish and dry, clinging to the beams the way a stain clings to linen, no matter how many times it is boiled. Frost still furred the lower panes. A sparrow had got in at some point in the last 2 decades, and died on the sill beneath the east window, and nobody had ever swept it away. Julian turned at the sound of her boots on the flags, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because the last time they had stood in a room together, his mother had been 6 days dead, and Eliza's father had already begun to be spoken of, in low voices, as the man who killed her. "You are Marcia's daughter," he said at last, and it was not quite a question, though there was a question folded somewhere inside it. Eliza set down her bag of tools with more care than it strictly required. "I am the only glazier in this county who would take your grandmother's shilling, my lord," she said, "which is not quite the same thing, though I understand it comes to the same face." Something moved behind his eyes then, quick as a bird crossing a window, gone before she could name it. He did not correct her use of his title, and he did not soften it either. He asked, instead, whether she meant to begin with the vestry, and when she said she did, he told her that the window there had not been touched since the fire, not by anyone, on his grandmother's express instruction, and that she should expect the frame to be in poor condition. She had expected that already, from the state of everything else in the building, and said so, and he almost smiled, the way a man smiles at a thing he has decided in advance not to find funny. They talked a while longer than either of them had any real reason to, about lead and weather, and the particular way frost gets into old stone and never fully leaves it again. And Eliza noticed, without meaning to notice it, that he kept his left wrist turned inward against his coat sleeve the entire time. As a man keeps a hand over a candle flame he does not want the wind to find. She had seen that same small guarding motion in men who carried old burns, and she filed the observation away without examining it, the way she filed away most things about the Alderleys, because it did not do to look too closely at people who could ruin you with a word. He left before she had properly begun her count of the panes, pausing at the door to say that he was glad, in point of fact, that it was a Marsh doing the work, because his mother had always liked her father's glass better than anything shipped in from the county town, and that this was the nearest he had ever come, in 18 years, to saying so out loud to anyone. He said it plainly, without ornament, the way a man puts down a weight he has carried so long he has half forgotten it is a weight at all. And then he was gone before she could decide whether to thank him for it or resent him for having waited 18 years to say it. She stood alone in the vestry a long while after his footsteps had faded across the frozen churchyard, running her thumb along the cold lip of the window frame, feeling under the paint and grime for the shape of her father's old work, and thinking that whatever else the day had given her, it had also given her the first small crack of doubt in a story she had spent her whole life believing was closed. The frame did not feel, under her fingers, like the work of a careless man. The county came out in force for the reading of the banns 3 Sundays before Christmas. Not because anyone imagined the young Baron and Miss Cordelia Fane had any need of God's blessing to marry, their fortunes being already so thoroughly agreed between the 2 family solicitors that the church seemed almost an afterthought, but because there is no entertainment in a small shire to rival the sight of the gentry parading their good luck in public. Eliza stood at the back with the other tradespeople, unnoticed in the way she had trained herself to be unnoticed, and watched Miss Fane come up the aisle on her father's arm in wine-colored wool that had cost more than Eliza would earn mending glass in a year, and thought, with the flat honesty she reserved for herself alone, that the young woman was neither foolish nor unkind, which made the whole business harder to dislike than she would have preferred. Cordelia Fane had a wide, quick, curious face, and the sort of laugh that did not care who heard it, and she stopped on her way back down the aisle after the service to ask Eliza directly whether it was true she was mending the old chapel, and when Eliza said it was, Cordelia said she thought that a very fine thing, and that she hoped to see the inside of it herself before Christmas, since Julian would tell her nothing about it beyond the fact that it needed doing. There was no malice anywhere in the exchange, and that, more than any cruelty could have done, unsettled something in Eliza that she did not care to examine standing in a churchyard full of watching neighbors. It was Mr. Silas Gray who did the actual work of unsettling her, a few minutes later, drawing her aside near the lich gate, with the easy proprietary manner of a man who managed every account on the estate, and had long ago stopped distinguishing between managing money and managing people. He was neither young nor old, dressed always a shade better than his position strictly required, and he had a way of tilting his head while he listened that made a person feel, for as long as his attention lasted, quite remarkably important. He told her the family was grateful for her willingness to take on so delicate a task, delicate being the word he chose, and he hoped she would understand that speed mattered a great deal more than perfection, given the season, and given how very much the young baron's marriage meant to the estate's fortunes just now. He said this last part lightly, as though it were merely conversation, but his thumb turned his signet ring once around his finger as he said it, a small, unconscious adjustment, and Eliza noted it, the way she noted a crack in a pane before the light had even fully shown it to her. She told him she meant to do the work properly, or not at all, and he smiled at that, a smile that arrived a moment before his eyes agreed to it, and excused itself a moment after his mouth had finished with it. And he said, of course, nobody would dream of asking otherwise. And then he was gone into the crowd, with the particular smoothness of a man who has never in his life needed to raise his voice to get what he wants. Nan found her afterward, sitting on the low wall by the lich gate, with her hands pushed deep into her sleeves against the cold, and did not ask what was wrong, only sat down beside her and waited, which was Nan's particular gift. "It is not the wedding," Eliza said finally. "It is that every single person in that church looked straight through me the whole service, the way they have looked through me my whole life. And then Mr. Gray looked directly at me, and I liked that a good deal less." Nan grunted something that might have been agreement. "Your father used to say the same of him," she said, "that Silas Gray was the only man in the county who could tell you it was raining, while standing dry as a bone in the middle of a downpour, and make you doubt your own wet coat." Eliza turned that over for a moment, the cold coming up through the stone wall into the backs of her legs, and said, low enough that it was almost only for herself, that she did not know how a man got to be so certain of everything all the time, when everyone else in the world had to make do with doubt. Nan looked at her sideways then, with something in her face that was not quite pity and not quite warning. "Practice," she said, "or else he has never once in his life been made to answer for anything, which comes out looking the same from a distance." They walked home together in the fading light, past the chapel with its patched roof and its one lit window where Eliza had left a lamp burning against the frost. And Eliza found herself thinking, not of Cordelia Fane's kind, wide face, nor of the wedding that would knit the Alderley and Fane fortunes together before spring, but of Julian, standing in the chancel with his wrist turned in against his sleeve, and of the small, unaccountable warmth in his voice when he had spoken of his mother's liking for her father's glass. She did not examine why that particular memory should have outlasted all the others from the day. She only knew that it had, and that she carried it home with her, the way she carried the roundel, without quite meaning to, and without quite being able to set it down. She was 3 days into the vestry frame, working with a small knife to lift 18 years of grime from around the lead, when Julian began to come and stand in the doorway most afternoons, ostensibly to inspect the progress on his grandmother's behalf, though neither of them troubled to pretend that was the whole of it for very long. He would bring a stool from the nave and sit near enough to watch her hands, without ever quite offering to help, and she came to know the particular quality of his silences, which were not empty the way most men's silences were, but full, the way a held breath is full. It was on the 4th afternoon that he asked her, without any preamble at all, whether she remembered the night of the fire, and she set down her knife and told him plainly that she did, though she had been no more than 9 years old, and had mostly kept her memories at arm's length ever since, the way one keeps a hot coal at arm's length, rather than examine it for its color. She remembered being woken by the bell, she said, and being carried to the window by her father, who had gone very still and very quiet at the sight of the light in the sky over the manor grounds, stiller than she had ever seen him before or after. She remembered that he had gone out into the night without his coat, and had come back near dawn smelling of smoke, and had not spoken above a whisper for 3 days afterward. Julian listened to all of this with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor, and when she had finished, he was quiet himself for long enough that she nearly went back to her work. Then he said that he had been carried out of the house that same night by a groom he had never seen before or since, and that he remembered almost nothing of it directly, only fragments, a smell, a sound, the particular pressure of someone's hand closing hard around his wrist. He turned his left hand over as he said it, for the first time in her presence, and showed her the old burn scarring the inside of his wrist, pale and puckered, running from the heel of his palm nearly to his elbow. "I have never told anyone how I came by this," he said. "I have let them all assume it happened trying to reach her. It did not happen trying to reach her. I do not know how it happened. I only know that I woke with it, and that nobody has ever offered to tell me any more than that, and I have never asked, because asking felt like it would cost something I was not prepared to pay." Eliza looked at the scar a long moment, and then at him, and said, more gently than she generally allowed herself to speak to anyone above her station, that a person could go a very long way carrying a question they were afraid to ask, and that she knew that better than most people alive. He looked up at her then, with an expression she did not have a ready name for, something between relief and hunger, and he said that he did not think, until this last week, that there was anyone left in the county who understood that particular kind of carrying. And she told him, before she could think better of it, that glass never lies. It only ever shows you the light that was already there, which was her father's saying and not her own, but which seemed, in that moment, to belong to both of them equally. He repeated it back to her under his breath, testing the words the way a man tests a plank before he puts his weight on it,
and something passed between them in the cold vestry air that neither of them named and both of them felt, until the outer door banged open and Silas Gray came in on a gust of frost, all smiling apology for the interruption, carrying a ledger under one arm and the particular brightness of a man who has arrived at precisely the moment he intended to arrive.
He had come, he said, about the matter of the vestry window itself, since the estate could not in conscience ask Mistress Marsh to patch 18 years of rot, when a full new frame and glass would serve the family so much better, and would in fact be quicker, given the season, if she would agree to strip the old frame out entirely rather than mend it piece by piece. He named a sum for the work that was more than fair, more than generous even, and he named a date, Christmas Eve, by which it must be finished, and he said all of this looking not at Eliza, but at Julian, in the manner of a man settling an account rather than making a request. Eliza thought of the discrepancy she had already begun to notice in the old lead, a seam repaired by a hand that was not her father's, and some instinct she could not yet name told her to refuse the bargain, to insist on mending rather than stripping, on keeping the old frame whole so she might go on reading it at her own pace. But the sum offered would clear the whole of what she and Nan owed for the winter's coal, and clear it twice over. And pride, she reminded herself, sitting alone afterward with the roundel warm in her palm, was a luxury her father had been able to afford, and she could not. She agreed to the terms before she had properly finished weighing them, and it was only walking home in the dark, past the black bulk of the chapel with its one lit window, that she understood she had just agreed to tear out, board by board, the very thing that might tell her whether her father had truly been the careless man the county believed him to be, or whether somebody else's hand had been at work in that window long after his had left it. The discrepancy declared itself fully on a morning so cold the water in her flask had skinned over with ice, when Eliza worked the last length of old lead, came free from the vestry frame, and found, beneath the section nearest the sill, a seam that did not match anything else in the window. Her father's soldering had a particular signature, a small deliberate overlap at every joint, neat as a stitch, the mark of a man who had never in his working life cut a corner, even when nobody living would ever have known the difference. The seam beneath the sill had none of that neatness. It had been done in haste, by a hand unpractised in the trade, using a solder that had gone grey and brittle with age in a way her father's never did, and it sat directly beneath the section of frame that the old accounts, which she had begged a look at from the sexton's widow, recorded as having been replaced only 11 days before the fire, not 18 years untouched, as everyone in the county had always assumed. She carried the whole puzzle home that evening, laid it out across the table between the bread and the tallow candle, and Nan listened with her hands gone still in her lap, which for a woman who was never still was its own kind of answer. "I was in the manor kitchens the winter of the fire," Nan said finally, "and I have held my tongue about it 18 years, because holding my tongue was cheaper than losing my place, and because a scullery maid's word was never going to outweigh a steward's account in front of any magistrate in this shire. But I will tell you what I saw, if you are ready to carry it, because a thing you know and cannot prove sits in you exactly like a stain that has gone in too deep for scrubbing, and it will not come out on its own, no matter how long you leave it soaking. And I am tired, Eliza. I am tired of carrying it alone." Eliza said she was ready, though she was not certain, even as she said it, that this was true. Nan told her that she had seen Mr. Gray, then new to his post, and not yet the steward he later became, crossing the yard toward the chapel that same night with a lantern, well before the alarm bell rang, at an hour when, by his own later account, he claimed to have been abed in the manor 2 full fields away. She had said nothing at the time, because she had been 9 years old herself in every way that mattered, frightened and unschooled, and entirely without standing. And by the time she was old enough to understand what she had seen, the story had already hardened into stone around Thomas Marsh's name, and there had seemed no way through it that would not simply break her along with it. "Stains you leave for later are the ones that ruin the whole cloth," she said, wringing her own hands together as though they still held wet linen. "I should have spoken it while it was fresh. I did not, and I have watched an innocent man carry another man's guilt to his grave for it, and watched his daughter carry it after him. And I will not sit here and watch you carry it one day longer than I can help." Eliza sat with that a long while, the candle guttering low, and found that what she felt was not triumph, though some part of her had always longed to hear her father's name cleared, but something closer to grief, old grief reopened, sharp as the first day. She asked Nan directly whether she believed Silas Grey had set the fire himself, and Nan said she did not know, that she had seen a man with a lantern and nothing more, and that the difference between a man who causes a fire and a man who simply lets one burn to his advantage might matter a great deal in a court of law, and not at all in the eyes of God, but that either way, the scene beneath that sill was not her father's work, and somebody had gone back into that vestry after the fire to make it look as though it were.
"There is one more thing," Nan said, quieter now. "Old Sexton Pratt, who kept this parish 40 years, and never told a lie in his life, so far as I know, was the one who patched that frame at Mr. Gray's own instruction, in the week after the fire, working from a design Mr. Gray supplied him, and Pratt never did trust the arrangement, nor the haste of it. He told me once, years after, half in his cups, that he had left something of his own inside that window before he closed it up again. A kind of insurance, he called it, in case anyone with proper standing ever came asking the right questions. He never told me what, nor where, and he went to his own grave 3 winters back, without ever saying more. Eliza sat a long while after that, with the roundel turning slowly in her fingers, the wren's small painted wing catching a last of the candlelight, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her chest like cold water finding its level, that whatever Sexton Pratt had hidden in that frame was still there, waiting inside the very wood and lead she had agreed, for the sake of a winter's coal, to tear out whole by Christmas Eve. She found it on a morning of hard blue frost, 3 days after Nan's confession, prizing loose the final section of the old sill frame with a chisel gone half numb in her own cold fingers, when a strip of oiled cloth fell out from a cavity behind the lowest timber and struck the flagstones with a sound too soft to be mistaken for anything but paper. She did not open it at once. She sat on the cold floor of the vestry with it in her lap for a long moment, thinking of her father's 9 years of whispered protest, of Nan's 18 years of held tongue, of Julian's wrist turned in against his sleeve, and thought that whatever was inside this small parcel had already cost more than any piece of writing had a right to cost, before she had ever unwrapped it once. She went, instead of reading it there alone, to find Silas Grey, not because she trusted him, but because some part of her still wanted, before she believed the worst, to hear whether he had an answer that did not require it. She found him in the estate office going over the Christmas accounts, and she laid the discrepancy before him plainly, the mismatched seam, the sexton's confession of a hasty repair done to Gray's own instruction, and watched his face while she did it. He did not flinch, and that in itself told her something, because an innocent man surprised by an old accusation generally shows some flicker of confusion before he composes himself, and Silas Gray showed none at all, only a stillness that arrived a beat too smoothly, like a door closing on oiled hinges. He told her, with every appearance of patience, that Sexton Pratt had indeed done hurried work in the vestry after the fire, at his instruction, because the family could not bear to look upon a ruined window through an entire season of mourning, and that haste, not malice, accounted for whatever imperfection she had found. He said that digging in the ashes of an old grief served no one, least of all the young baron on the eve of his marriage. And he said it kindly, reasonably, the way a man says a true and useful thing, and for a moment Eliza almost believed that reasonableness was the whole of him. "I am not a cruel man," he said, folding his hands over the ledger before him. "I have kept this estate solvent through years its own family very nearly ran into the ground, and I have done it by knowing which doors are better left shut than opened, which is a kind of mercy the young mistake for coldness, because they have never yet had to hold anything heavier than their own feelings." Eliza told him, as steadily as she could manage, that her father had held something a great deal heavier than his own feelings for 18 years, namely, another man's guilt, and that she did not think mercy was the word for what had been done to him. Gray's hand went to his cuff then, straightening it though it did not need straightening, and he said, more quietly, that the past served no one, that the dead asked nothing of the living, and that he hoped, for her own sake and for the sake of a wedding that would secure this county's peace for a generation, she would leave well enough alone. It was, she thought afterward, walking back across the frozen churchyard with the oiled cloth parcel held against her chest beneath her cloak, the most honest thing he had said to her yet, not because it was true, but because it was the first time he had told her plainly what he wanted, rather than dressing it as concerned for her welfare. She did not open the letter until she was home, at her own table, with Nan's hand resting on her shoulder and the tallow candle burned down to its last inch. The hand that had written it was a woman's hand, careful and unhurried despite what must have been a very short span of time in which to write it, and it was addressed not to any particular person, but to whoever mends this window next, in the manner of a message left in a bottle by someone who could not be certain it would ever reach a living reader at all. Lady Margaret Alderley had written that she had discovered, some weeks before her death, discrepancies in the estate accounts that could only be explained by her husband's young steward diverting rents and timber sales to his own private ledger over a period of years, and that she had told him plainly she meant to lay the matter before her husband within the week. She had gone to the chapel that night, she wrote, to fetch a parish record she needed as proof, and had found the vestry door already unlatched, and a lamp already lit within, though she had expected the building to be empty and dark. She had written no further account of what happened after that, whether by design or because she had run out of time, but she had left one line standing alone at the foot of the page,
that struck Eliza harder than anything else in the whole document. A line that read, "If anything befalls me before I can speak this aloud myself, let it be known that Thomas Marsh's hands never once failed this house, and that I would trust my own son's life to his lead sooner than I would trust it to the smooth word of any man who has never once had to answer for his own work."
Eliza did not sleep that night, nor much of the one after, and it was on the second morning, grey and threatening snow, that ruin found her exactly where she least wanted it to. She had gone to the manor at first light to bring Julian the letter before her own courage could fail her, and she found him alone in the library, and she told him everything in as few words as she could manage, watching the colour leave his face by degrees as she spoke, watching him read his mother's hand for the first time in 18 years, with his own hand pressed flat against the old scar at his wrist, as though he could hold the two things together by main force. He said nothing for a long while after he had finished reading. Then he said, very low, that he had always known, somewhere beneath the knowing he allowed himself, that the story he had been given did not fit the shape of the wound in his own memory, and that he had chosen, every year for 18 years, not to press on it. "I let a good man's daughter grow up beneath a lie my own family should have questioned," he said. "I let it happen because questioning it would have meant questioning Gray, and questioning Gray would have meant admitting how much of this house has run on his word alone for longer than I can properly account." He had not finished speaking when the door opened without ceremony, and Silas Gray came in, and behind him, drawn by some errand of her own, came the Dowager Lady Henrietta Alderley, silver-headed and upright as a mast, and behind her, arriving last and least expected, Cordelia Fane, still in her travelling cloak with snow not yet melted from her shoulders. There was no time to hide the letter, and Eliza would not have hidden it if there had been. Gray's eyes went to the paper in Julian's hand, and something crossed his face too quickly to name, gone before it had properly arrived, and he said, with admirable steadiness, that he did not know what forgery the glazier's daughter had brought into this house, but that a family in mourning 18 years past deserved better than to have old grief dredged up on the strength of a scullery tale and a scrap of unsigned paper. He turned to the Dowager as he said it, appealing to her directly, and for one terrible moment Eliza watched Julian hesitate, some old habit of deference rising in him even now, some fear of what it would cost the estate, and the engagement, and the wedding already half arranged, to name Gray a thief, and worse, before his own grandmother had a chance to weigh the matter herself. He did not speak quickly enough to prevent Gray from turning next to Eliza and saying, with a courtesy that had gone cold all the way through, that he would be obliged to report to the magistrate that valuable estate correspondence had gone missing from the chapel under her care, and that theft was theft, whatever story was woven around it, and that she should consider very carefully, for her aunt's sake as much as her own, whether she wished to make an enemy of him in front of witnesses. Eliza felt the whole room's attention swing toward her, like a door on a hinge, and she felt, too, the old familiar instinct to make herself small, to apologize, to hand back the letter and go home, and be grateful she had not lost more than her pride. And she hated that instinct more in that moment than she had ever hated anything in her life. Nobody spoke. The Dowager's face had gone unreadable as carved stone, and Cordelia Fane's quick eyes moved from Gray to Julian to Eliza and back again, taking the measure of something none of them had yet said aloud. And Julian, when he finally opened his mouth, said only her name, quietly, as though he did not yet know what was meant to follow it. And in the silence that came after, Eliza understood that whatever safety she had allowed herself to imagine in this house had just been taken from her, cleanly, in front of the very people who might have granted it.
Nobody moved to stop her when she left the library, and nobody came after her either, and she walked the 2 miles home through the first fine needles of snow, with the letter still clenched inside her cloak, no longer certain it was safe anywhere at all. The dowager sent for her that same evening, not to the library, but to her own private sitting room, and offered her, without preamble, a settlement, a sum large enough to see Eliza and Nan comfortable for the rest of their lives, in exchange for the letter, her silence, and her withdrawal from the parish before the new year. It would be quieter this way for everyone, the dowager said, her voice carrying the particular calm of a woman who has made peace with unpleasant arithmetic many times before. Your father's name can be cleared privately, in the parish register, without a single word said in public that might unmake this family in the same breath it remakes his. Nobody wins from a scandal at Christmas, Mistress Marsh. Eliza sat with the offer a long moment, feeling its considerable weight, thinking of the coal bin at home and Nan's aching hands, and how very much easier every single day of the rest of her life could be made by simply nodding once. Then she thought of her father, sitting up nights for 9 years, insisting to an empty room that his hands had never failed anyone. And she said, quite plainly, that she would not take money to keep a dead woman's letter unread, that glass never lied, and she did not intend to start lying on its behalf now, and that if her father's name was worth clearing at all, it was worth clearing where the whole county that had condemned him could hear it done. The dowager's face did not change, but something in her eyes did, briefly, something that might almost have been respect. Julian came to her 2 days later, on the coldest evening of that whole hard December, and told her, with his hands laced tightly together and his wrist turned in against his sleeve out of old habit, that he thought it best if she took the settlement after all, that he could not in conscience let her risk a magistrate's court on his family's account, that he would find some other way to see Gray answered for, and her father's name restored, without requiring her to stand in the middle of it and be broken by whatever Gray chose to say about her in return. He meant it, she could see that plainly, meant it as an act of protection rather than cowardice, but it landed on her exactly as every other kindness the world had ever offered her had landed, as another door being closed for her own good, by someone who had never once had to live behind a closed door himself. You did not ask me what I wanted, she said. You did not ask, and you did not ask, and you did not ask. And every time you decide for me what is safest, you take away the one thing that has ever actually been mine to decide, which is what I will and will not accept in exchange for my own name. He tried to answer that, and found, for the first time in their whole acquaintance, that he had no answer ready, and she did not wait for him to find one. She walked home alone through the dark, with the wind rising sharp off the fields, past the black shoulder of the chapel, where a storm was already beginning to worry at the loose slates on the roof, and she found Nan, waiting up,
with a letter still hidden beneath a floorboard where they had put it for safekeeping. And she told her aunt, in a voice gone flat with exhaustion, that perhaps the wisest course, after all, was simply to burn the wretched thing, take whatever coin was offered, and let the whole county go on believing whatever it had always believed, since believing the truth seemed to cost more than either of them had left to spend. Nan did not scold her for it.
She only asked, very quietly, whether Eliza thought her father, sitting up all those long 9 years, insisting on his own innocence to an empty room, had ever once considered that the truth cost too much, and decided to stop asking for it anyway. And Eliza sat with the fire burning low, and found that she could not answer that question either, not that night. And she went to bed with the storm rattling the loose slates above her, and did not sleep, and woke before dawn with her mind entirely made up, alone, the way the hardest decisions always seem to arrive, in the coldest hour, with nobody else yet awake to share the weight of it. The storm blew itself out some time before dawn on Christmas Eve, and the morning that followed was rinsed and hard and impossibly bright, the kind of cold, clear light that makes every edge in the world look freshly cut. And it was in that light that Eliza walked up to the chapel of St. Anne for the last time before the evening service, carrying the letter openly in her hand, rather than hidden beneath her cloak, because she had decided in the small hours that she was done with hiding anything at all. The new vestry window stood finished behind her, 41 panes reset in fresh lead, and in the uppermost corner, where the first light of any winter morning would always strike it first, she had set her father's small round wren, no longer riding in her apron pocket, but fixed now where it could be seen by anyone who thought to look up. The whole county came that evening, as the whole county always comes to a Christmas service, whatever private grudges it is nursing, filling the nave and the aisles and standing 3 deep at the back where Eliza herself had once stood unnoticed. And the dowager sat in the family pew, with Julian beside her, and Cordelia Fane, still and composed, on his other side. And Silas Gray stood near the chancel step, attending to some final arrangement of candles with the easy competence of a man who has never once doubted his own place in a room. It was the dowager herself, when the moment for prayers had passed and the congregation had begun to shift and murmur in the particular restless way of a crowd that senses something is coming, who rose and asked that a letter be read aloud, so that all present might hear the same words at the same time, and no rumor be left to grow crooked in the telling afterward. Eliza read it herself, standing where the light from the new window fell across the page, and she read every word of Lady Margaret Alderley's hand exactly as it had been written. The discovery of the diverted accounts, the unlatched door, the lamp already burning where no lamp should have been, and the line at the foot of the page, naming Thomas Marsh's hands as ones that had never once failed this house. The church was entirely silent while she read, 300 people holding their breath together, and it was into that silence that Silas Gray moved, quickly, before anyone had quite finished absorbing what they had heard, crossing the chancel step and reaching for the letter in Eliza's hand, with the plain intention of thrusting it into the nearest candle flame. And it was that single unguarded lunge, more than any word he had ever spoken, that told the whole watching county everything it needed to know. Because an innocent man does not reach for a burning candle in the middle of a church full of witnesses. Julian caught his wrist before the paper ever touched the flame, and for a moment the 2 men stood locked together at the chancel step, in full view of everyone the county held dear. And Gray, finding himself held and seen at last, went very still.
and something in his face gave way that had never given way before. Not fear exactly, nor grief exactly, but the particular collapse of a man who has spent so long building a wall between himself and his own history that he has forgotten there was ever a person living behind it. He said, very quietly, in a voice gone entirely unlike his usual smooth register, that he had never meant for her ladyship to die, that he had only meant to delay her discovering the accounts until he could set them right again himself, that he had spent 18 years trying to repay, in secret and in silence, a debt he could never fully make good, and that he supposed he had known, every single Christmas since, that a night like this one was coming for him, eventually.
Nobody in that church cheered, and nobody jeered either. And Eliza found, watching him led away between two of the estate's own grooms, that she felt something closer to a tired sorrow than to triumph. The particular flat sadness of watching a clever man arrive, far too late, at the one honest sentence he had owed the world for 18 years. Cordelia Fane rose then, in the hush that followed, and said, to the whole assembled county, that she had long suspected certain irregularities in the accounts her own father had been asked to guarantee against the marriage settlement, and that she would not now, nor ever, complete an engagement built on ground she no longer trusted. And she said it kindly, to Julian directly, releasing him from the contract with a grace that cost her something visible, and asked for nothing in return. And the honorable thing she did that night was remembered in the parish, long after every other detail of the evening had softened into legend. The dowager crossed the whole width of the nave herself, in front of everyone, and took both of Eliza's hands in her own, and said, plainly enough for the back pews to hear it, that this family owed the House of Marsh an apology 18 years overdue, and that she was old enough now to say so without shame, and the congregation, warming through the cold building like a hearth catching at last, began at that to file out into the frost-bright churchyard, leaving the new window glowing gold and green behind them, with the wren, caught still and small, in its uppermost corner. The chapel emptied slowly, voices and lantern light draining away across the churchyard into the frozen dark, until only Eliza and Julian remained inside it. The candles burned low, the new glass holding what little light was left, and giving it back gently into the cold air between them. He came and stood where he had stood that very first morning, hat in hand, though there was no hat to hold now, and he told her, without any of his old careful distance, that he had spent every day since her last words to him turning them over, and that she had been entirely right, that he had spent his whole life letting other people decide what was safest for him to know, and had, without ever meaning to, done exactly the same thing to her, closing doors on her behalf that were never his to close. I am not asking you to forgive that tonight, he said. I am only asking what it would take for you to trust that I have understood it. Eliza looked at him a long moment in the glow of her father's window, and said that she did not want an apology dressed as a proposal, nor a proposal dressed as an apology, and that if he wished to know what she would and would not accept, she would tell him plainly and only once. She would not be his under any name but her own. Her father's warrant was to be restored in the parish record before the year turned, in ink, in public, with no quiet private clearing tucked away where the county could forget it by spring. She would keep her own trade and her own signature upon it, licensed in her own right and not under any cousin's browed name, whatever the guild in the county town had to say about it. And she would not be sent away again, not once,
Not for her own good, nor anyone else's, not ever, not by him. He listened to every condition without once looking away from her, and when she had finished, he said only that every one of them was already granted before she had asked, and that he had come tonight, meaning to offer them unprompted, and had simply been too slow, as he so often was, to say the true thing before the moment for saying it had nearly closed. They were married the following autumn in that same chapel, the roof mended, the weather vane's small copper wren finally worked loose from its 18-year rust, and turning free in the wind for the first time since the fire. And the whole county came again, as it had come at Christmas, filling every pew and standing 3 deep at the back, and Thomas Marsh's name stood carved that same year into a new stone set beside the vestry door, plain and permanent, glazier of this parish, his hands never once failed this house. A year on from that first Christmas, on a morning of hard, clean frost, much like the one that had opened the whole business, Eliza stood again in the chancel of St. Anne's, with a small child balanced on her hip, and she lifted the little one up toward the high corner of the vestry window, so that the morning light came slanting through her father's small painted wren, and fell warm across both their faces at once. And the child reached out one open hand toward the glass, exactly the way Eliza herself remembered reaching for it as a girl. And Nan, standing nearby with her sleeves rolled to the elbow out of pure habit, though there was no washing to be done that morning, said that some things, it seemed, ran in the blood as surely as any name ever could, and did not smile, though her eyes were not dry either. If this quiet Christmas found its way to you tonight, and something in it settled near your chest the way a small square of colored glass settles warm in an open hand, then stay by the fire with us a little longer before the last of the light goes down.
I keep thinking of that carved stone by the vestry door, of a name finally set right, where the whole county could read it. And I wonder which door in your own life is still waiting, on its own quiet Christmas, to be opened. If you would like more evenings like this one, channel name Keeps the Hearth Lit, and another story always waiting on the good hooks by the door. So settle in, and stay close, if you'd care to hear the next one told. The kettle is already on, the wick is burning low and steady, and there is time yet before the fire needs banking. Sleep gently tonight, and be kind to whoever is waiting for you in the morning.